Maimonides, Maimonides is less well known as a responder than he is as an elegant and authoritative codifier of Jewish law, daring and supremely rational theologian and magisterial medical authority.
So when we think of the Rambam, we think of intellectual excellence. We don't think of a nice, warm, fuzzy, empathetic character. We think of rigorous intellectual acumen. We think of great expertise. We think of the mind, the supreme mental mind of rabbinical tradition, Rambam. One wouldn't necessarily want to find sympathy or empathy in the Maimonidean quarter. So that, of course, is why his tshuvot would be very interesting, because, as we already said, the tshuva is response to the time. It's not sitting in an ivory tower and reflecting on law or theology. It's actually real issues, real people. Good evening, Jeff.
Hi.
Tshuvot are real people, real issues, the Jewish community. Was Rambam involved? And are we going to see a more human side to him when we look at his tshuvot? So, Jack.
Yes.
He was, however,
a prolific responder and answered questions on all aspects of Jewish law and lore addressed to him from all over the Jewish world. Studying his Responsa provides an opportunity to glimpse at the great eagle.
The great eagle. Rambam is often called HaNesher HaGadol, the great eagle, because of his mental abilities, okay? But he is also a dynamic...
As a dynamic halachist, seeking solutions to practical problems and taking the issues of the day into account when crafting those solutions.
As we saw with Rashi, known to us as the great commentator, also happens to be in his tshuvot, at least the ones we read, very much in touch with the conditions of his time, the problems facing the Jewish people, and he didn't hesitate to craft a very dramatic approach to the preservation of Jewish identity in the face of forced baptism. Now, how do we see the Rambam in that mold? Well, let's read on. Jeff, I'm going to ask you please to take it from line 11. It is nevertheless. But you have to unmute. Unmute.
It is nevertheless a fact that Maimonides' responses are not the subject of widespread study, and there are a number of reasons for this neglect.
In other words, you probably heard a lot about Shut HaRashba, Shut HaRamah, all sorts of shutim, all sorts of responsa. Rarely do we learn a responsum of the Rambam. Why is that the case?
The first is the linguistic barrier. The majority of responsa are written in Arabic, although a minority are closed in Hebrew, have come down to us in Hebrew translation. The first main collection of Maimonides' responsa, known as Pe'er Hador, was published in Amsterdam in 1765 and consisted of 158 answers to questions in both Hebrew and Arabic.
That's a long time after his death, and only 158 tshuvot. He wrote many, many more, but they're in Arabic. And read the next line, please, Jeff.
The rabbinic translator of the Arabic responsa admits that he had difficulty in understanding the Arabic, and this is evident in his translations.
So if you want to read Shut Beirador, you read a rabbi saying, look, we found some of his tshuvot already translated into Hebrew. Most of them were in Arabic. I know Arabic. I tried to translate them, but I did a bad job. So that's not very conducive to getting involved in the tshuvot of the Rambam.
Yeah.
The first scientific edition,
consisting of 178 responsa, was published by A. Lichtenberg in Leipzig in 1859. This was followed by A.H.
Abraham Chaim Freiman,
collection of Hebrew responsa, published in 1934. And J. Blau's comprehensive collection, both Arabic and Hebrew responsa, published between 1958 and 1965.
Now, the Blau edition is the definitive one. And that has the Arabic text with a Hebrew text next to it. And it gives you the sources and points you back. But it's still difficult linguistically, because you can't get to grips with the original text. Now, that's only one barrier to the popularity of the Rambam. It isn't only the language. What is it? Let's see who else is here who would like to read. Do I have another reader? Avi. Can we have line 22, please?
Sure. In addition to the language barrier, Maimonides' responsa are often very terse, and he tends to omit the original question, which the reader has to work out from the answer. In this respect, they are closer in style to the Gaonim than to the period of the Rishonim. Some of his replies are brief in the extreme. In one responsum, on the question of the liability of a shochet to compensate the owner of an animal which he had slaughtered in such a manner that it was unfit for consumption.
Of course, the purchaser, the guy who owned the animal, said that the shochet was negligent. So there's a question of when you have to compensate if you are a mumche, if you're a specialist. Now, I'm looking at the style here. Maimonides
simply writes two words and is Chayav l'shalem Moshe ben Rav Maimon Zatzal.
That's it. In other words, you have and the question consisted of?
The question consisted of 67 words.
So you have a questioner who's written a question with 67 words, and he gets a reply from the Rambam, Chayav l'shalem Moshe ben Rav Maimon Zatzal. That's pretty short, and not what you're used to. The rabbi usually goes on and on and on, covers pages with abbreviations and lots of references to the Talmud. All the Rambam has to say is Chayav l'shalem. So this goes to the Rambam's style. He's more authoritative. He speaks back to the period of the Gaonim, where they didn't write very lengthy tshuvot because they were giving answers to questions for the entire jury. And why explain something which probably most people would not really understand anyhow. The next, in another responsum, Avi.
In another responsum, this time addressed to Rav Pinchas HaDayan of Alexandria, who asked Maimonides to comment on the lengthy ruling he had issued, Maimonides simply writes, Din emet ve'ein bo
Lifnim belifnai, Moshe Reb Maimon HaDayan Zatzal. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Goodbye. Now, Maimonides, it was still Maimonides. Whilst we're going to read an interesting tshuva or two or three or four, he's still Maimonides. Now, he's in Egypt. He is the major luminary of the Jewish world. Nobody comes close to him in halakha or in Jewish theology. He's in Cairo. The nearest rabbi of any worth is Pinchas HaDayan of Alexandria. He's a long way away. Now, Pinchas HaDayan thinks he's an equal of the Rambam. The Rambam wastes no opportunity to show him that he's not his equal at all. In other words, if you read the correspondence, Pinchas HaDayan tries to impress Rambam with his learning, and Rambam usually deflates him. So this is the Rambam. You've got to accept that rather prickly aspect to his personality. And this is another put down. Pinchas HaDayan wanted to get a long comment from Rambam on his interesting tshuva. And all the Rambam says, you know what? This is so simple. It's so straightforward. En bo lifnim, en bo panai. Don't waste my time. It's okay. Goodbye. So that's the Rambam's tshuvot in a nutshell. They're difficult to understand because of the language, and his style is not often very friendly. But we will read a tshuva or two and see that he is in fact a true meshiv, taking into account the conditions of his time. But since we made a connection with the Gaonim, the truth is that Rambam had a very empathetic side when Jewish communities were in distress and they called out to him and cried out to him for help. So here, rather than looking at his tshuvot, we need to look at his igrot, the famous letters, two of which were written to Yemen, a Jewish community at the time, a long time ago, that was often found itself in distress because of Muslim fanaticism. Some things don't change. Muslim fanaticism in Yemen, Jewish community was persecuted, was also pressured on the inside by various rabbis who made these Jews who pretended to be Muslims feel bad. And also there was a false Messiah. People running around Yemen saying, I am the Mashiach. So the Yemenite community turned to Rambam in its distress. The Rambam wrote some very sympathetic and empathetic tshuvot. So, Michael, please, line 32, Maimonides.
To the Gaonim, in that he wrote lengthy monographs to Jewish communities, especially Yemen, in order to clarify pressing matters of Jewish theology. These are known collectively as Igrot HaRambam, the most famous being A, Igeret Hashmad, dealing with Jews who underwent forced but insincere conversion to Islam in order to survive.
Now, this is a very interesting letter indeed. Rambam was asked by the community in Yemen in relation to pretending to be a Muslim in order to survive. You have the fanatic Muslims raced around on their camels saying, you Jews, either you convert or you die. So many of them converted, but you didn't need to do much to convert to Islam. And they never believed or intended that what they said when they recited the Shada, the article of faith about God and Muhammad his prophet, they denied it in their hearts and in their minds. A rabbi arose who told them that you're all sinners, you should all have given up your lives. Rambam writes a fascinating Igeret to the entire community saying, don't pay any attention to that rabbi. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and you are okay. Of course, in the aftermath of this Igeret, some scholars give credence to the fact that perhaps the Maimon family did something similar in those lost years between the arrival of the Almohades in Spain and the arrival of the Maimon family in Fez. There are 8 years, as we said, when we talked about the Moreh Nevuchim, when the Rambam and his family went underground. Did they perhaps become anusim? Did they insincerely convert? Well, it's a dispute amongst historians to the present day, and I well remember Jean saying to me at the time, and you will remember this, Jean, you said you've never heard a rabbi give credence to the fact that the Rambam and his family may have been anusim for a while. So this is your first rabbi who opens up the possibility. And the Igeret HaShmad is a reasoned defense of those Jews who did say the Shada in order to save their lives. And Rambam said, you did not need to die al Kiddush Hashem. So we might talk about that a little later. But let's have a look at the next one. Igeret Teiman. Teiman, of course, is also Yemen. Michael, please, line 36.
And B, Igeret Teiman on false messiahs, Islam and Christianity. And C, Igeret
Again,
Tchiat
the Yemenite community called out to the Rambam. They had somebody who claimed to be the Messiah. How do we know if he's a true Mashiach or not? And why are we always persecuted by Islam, by Christianity? Why is the situation of the Jews so dire? And Rambam writes a very sympathetic and empathetic reply, known as Igeret Teiman. And from this, of course, we can gather why the Jews of Teiman would, in their Kaddish every day, say B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael u'lechayei HaRambam.
Marana.
Because, exactly, he gave them hope, he gave them support. So this is the human side coming through. Very kind. Finally, C. Michael, Igeret
Tchiat HaMetim, in which he clarifies his position with regard to the resurrection of the dead.
Now, Rambam got into a lot of hot water because his enemies found that his Achilles heel was the brief statement in his commentary to the Mishnah about Tchiyat HaMeitim. Do you remember what the Rambam said about Tchiyat HaMeitim? Does anybody remember? What's his idea of Tchiyat HaMeitim?
They come up and they
The
die.
automatism of the, not of the corpse, but of the shamot.
Not exactly, Jean. Rambam said, as Debbie says on my left here, the bodies will come back to life because this is promised by Nevi'im and is part of Torah Shabbat Peh, but then they will all die again. And why? Because for Rambam, there's no eternity if it's corporeal. If it's a physical thing, cannot last forever. So Tchiyat HaMeitim is an intermediate stage. This, of course, begs the question, why do you need Tchiyat HaMeitim if the Meitim are going to die again? So this was Rambam's way of getting out of a problem. Very similar to the problems, some of the problems we talked about in the Moreh Nevuchim. Philosophically speaking, he cannot accept that people will live in a physical form forever. On the other hand, the tradition says there will be a Tchiyat HaMeitim in physical form. So he gives you a compromise. Is it convincing? There's been a lot of ink spilt on that, and we'll leave it there. Amongst his shorter igrot, Michael, would you please conclude by going on to the next page?
Of course. Amongst his shorter igrot is the blistering critique of astrology, which he wrote in reply to a question asked by the French community of Montpellier.
Formidable. What a accent. Okay.
Merci bien.
So, mon plaisir.
No,
This is probably the most trenchant argument for rational Judaism ever. And Rambam again goes against the grain, astrologia, signs of the zodiac. We think of our old-fashioned machzorim, tfilat geshem, tfilat tal, pictures of the zodiac. I don't know whether you have those machzorim in your possession, but certainly we refer to the signs of the zodiac in kinot, in slichot, in piyutim. Ibn Ezra was a real heavy astrologer. Rambam writes this blistering critique, which we'll probably read just because the language is really blistering. And I can never pass up an opportunity to read out some Rambam when he gets onto a hobby horse. But now we're going to go into a tshuva of his. And let's see, who do we have who is going to be reading? Robert, I think that you're on. I mean, Robert Vassal, thank you. Line 3, Maimonides Responsum.
Maimonides Responsum on sincerity of motive in the process of converting to Judaism.
Okay. Gil, if you convert, do you need to be sincere?
Oh, yes.
And do we insist that you are sincere in your acceptance of the mitzvot before we convert you? Now,
Sure.
most of you would probably say yes. And you'll say,
yes.
yes, most Batei Din, Orthodox Batei Din, go to great lengths to make sure that anybody who is converted to Judaism really intends to adopt a halachic lifestyle. That would certainly be the impression we get in Chutz La'aretz from Orthodox Batei Din all over the diaspora, whether it's in Europe, Australia, North America, South America, anywhere you like. Orthodox Batei Din are very insistent, and therefore they're very ungenerous in converting, because they only want to convert those who will definitely be living an Orthodox lifestyle. Now, is there any basis for this in the Gemara? Okay, Robert, line number 5, the Talmud.
The Talmud, Yevamot 24b, requires sincerity of motive on the part of candidates for conversion in the first instance at any rate.
Milakatchila, you will not convert unless you think that your candidates are going to be good Orthodox Jews. I can read the Gemara. Say a man converts because he wants to marry a Jewish woman. Or a woman who's non-Jewish converts because she wants to marry a Jewish man. Or those who convert in biblical times because they wanted to join a powerful court like that of King David. L'shum avdei Shlomo, or even to be a slave of Solomon, was apparently a rise in your rank. Einam gerim divrei Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Nechemia says we don't accept these converts, and if they are converted, the conversion is invalid because they had an ulterior motive. They were not sincere. Rabbi Nechemia omer echad gerei arayot. Who are the gerei arayot? The Shomronim, or the Kutim. Lions were out in the period between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second, and they ate whoever was around in the land of Israel. So the people who had been transplanted there by the king of Assyria, they made themselves Jewish because they said the Jewish God of Eretz Israel is angry with us. He's sending lions to eat us up. And once they converted, apparently the lions stopped eating them. That's the story in the Gemara. Do with it what you like. Or some people have dreams. Now, this is a little more realistic. Why would you convert to Judaism? Well, I know people who've told me that they had a vision. God speaks to them from heaven and says, convert to Judaism. And this is absolutely true. So, people do convert, and they do convert for these, on the basis of these spiritual epiphanies. V'echad gerei Mordechai ve'Esther. Who are the gerei Mordechai ve'Esther?
ורבים מהארץ מתייהדים.
יפה מאוד, ורבים מהארץ מתייהדים. להתייהד, by the way, is reflexive. Why? And how does the pasuk continue, Jean? כי נפל
פחד מרדכי
היהודים
עליהם.
עליהם. Okay? They haben Meira von den Jiden. Okay? They were scared, a rare occurrence in history, but they actually were dead scared of the Jews, so they made themselves Jewish. Rabbi Nechemia says none of these can be regarded as valid conversions because they're all tainted with ulterior motive. That's not a truly sincere desire to be an observant Jew. Line 9. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta mishmei Rav halacha ki divrei haomer kulam gerim hem. Now, the Gemara ends up by saying, actually, if they underwent conversion, an Orthodox conversion, you do not take their Judaism away from them. Then the Gemara says, so why can't we convert them in the first instance? And then Rav Asi cites a pasuk in Mishlei, you want to avoid evil gossip and loose tongues. People will say the conversion was done for an ulterior motive and therefore it should not be valid. So we have a difference here between milekatchila and b'diavad. First instance, you do not convert for ulterior motive. In the latter case, you are allowed to. Let's see what the Rambam says. Robert, can you give me the next line, please, on line 12?
In his Mishnah Torah, Maimonides codifies this law as follows.
Maimonides does exactly what the Talmud says. Sodavar kahu, shamitzvah nechona kishiyavo ager, or agiyoret litgayer bodkin acharav, shema biglan mamon shiyitol. You have to check the motivation. Are they in it for the money? Do they want to marry into a rich Jewish family? Can only do so if they convert. Or bishlo sarah, or do they want to rise in the political ranks of Israel? Or pachad, or fear. Or if it's a man, we check whether he's got his eye on a Jewish woman or a Jewish, or a non-Jewish woman has her eye on a Jewish man. Em lo nimtzu lahem ilah. If we don't find any such ulterior motive, then we tell them how difficult it is to be Jewish, because we don't want them to convert. But if they do and they say, I'm going to continue no matter what, then we convert them. Shene'emar, as it says in the book of Ruth, Vatere ki mitametzet hi lalechet ita. Ruth, Naomi tried to discourage both Ruth and Orpah from going back to Bethlehem with her. Orpah left and stayed in Moab. Ruth kept on going, and it says ki mitametzet lihit ametz. She was making a tremendous effort and not letting up at all. So Naomi stopped arguing with her, and vatechta ledaber eleha, and the two of them set off to Bethlehem. Now let's have a look at the other aspect of the Gemara than the legal one. The Gemara is not only law, it's also stories. And here we have a story which is very, very well known, and I'm going to give it to you in English. Okay, Masechet Shabbat. There was a non-Jew who was passing by a Bet HaMidrash, and he hears the reader reading the pasuk, Ve'ela b'gadim asher yasu choshen ve'ephod. These are the clothes that the Kohen shall have. Will make him a choshen, a breastplate, an ephod, a decorative apron. Amar halalu lemi. So this non-Jew likes the idea of getting dressed up. He goes into the Bet HaMidrash and he says, what are we talking about, please? Who gets to wear these fancy clothes? So the answer is the Kohen Gadol. So the non-Jew says, okay, you know what? I really have a yen for fancy clothes, okay? I am sartorially fixated, and I'm going to become a Jew, so I can become a Kohen Gadol, and I can wear these great vestments. It comes to Shammai. This is in the time of Hillel and Shammai, the 1st century. And he says, look, Shammai, make me a ger so that I can become a Kohen Gadol. Shammai gives him a whack on the head with his builder's ruler and throws him out. Okay? Shammai says, don't be ridiculous. Balifnei Hillel. The candidate comes to Hillel. Girei. And Hillel converts him. Has he convinced him that he cannot be a Kohen Gadol? Has he given him a lesson in Torah? He converts him straight away. Should Hillel have converted him? I ask you on the basis of what we just learned in the Gemara and the Rambam, should Hillel have converted this guy who wants to be a Kohen Gadol and wear the Choshen and the ephod?
No, it shouldn't. He had an ulterior motive.
Exactly. Is this a reason for becoming a Jew? Preposterous. Inconceivable. Okay? Incomprehensible. Hillel, had he followed the law, should have done the same thing as Shammai. What did Hillel do? Amar lei, he says to the convert, he's now Jewish, Kloma midin melech el amisha yodeh taksisei malchut halach v'kara. You want to be a Kohen Gadol? Great. You have to learn the laws of being a Kohen Gadol. Let's study Torah together. So they study Torah, starting from Bereshit. Then they get to the book of Bamidbar. And what does the new Jew read? Hazar HaKarev Yumat. A non-Kohen who isn't born into a family of Kohanim, if he tries to get close to the service in the temple, he's put to death. Amale mikra zal minema. Then the new Jew says to Hillel, his teacher, who would this verse be talking about? Amale. So Hillel says to him, Afilu al David melech Israel. Even David, the king of Israel, cannot be a Kohen Gadol. Now, this new Jew has learned a lot. So he's got what we call in French a Yiddish kop. And what does he do? Nasar toger kal vachomer la'atzmo. The ger can now make a kal vachomer. He's imbibed enough Jewish learning to be able to make a good kal vachomer. And he says, Ma Yisrael shnikreim banim lamakom. Born Israelites who are called the children of God. Katuv alehem v'azara karev yumaat. They may not come close to the temple if they're not Kohanim by birth. Ger hakal, me, an insignificant ger. Shebaba maklova tarmilo, who came with his staff and his backpack. Alachat kama v'chama. How much more? I cannot be a Kohen Gadol. Of course I can't, but I'm happy that I'm Jewish. So this is already a very interesting story. It's the role of Agadah vis-a-vis Halacha. Halacha tells us the law, and Agadah, the narrative, tells us the life. And we see a marriage of the two. Balifei Shammai Amale. Now this new Jew is full of Jewish learning confidence, comes to Shammai and he says to him, Klum ra'ui ani liot Kohen Gadol. Of course I can't be a Kohen Gadol. Halo katuv b'Torah v'azar hakarev yumat, as if to say, why didn't you teach me that? Why weren't you like Hillel? Why did you simply bash me on the head and send me away? Balifnei Hillel, amar lo anvatan Hillel, gentle or meek Hillel, yanuchu lecha brachot al roshecha. May blessings rest on your head, shikravtani takat kanfei Shechina, because you brought me under the wings of the Shechina. Now, nevertheless, it's a nice, very touching story. Hillel is a very nice guy, and Hillel's educational program works. But was he halachically correct? Should he have, before the education, acceded to the candidate's request and converted him before he'd educated him, when he had a clear ulterior motive? But let me give you a more risque example from the Gemara of a similar piece of rabbinic discretion, perhaps. This is the famous Gemara in Masechet Melachot. I'll give it to you in English, but you can read it in Hebrew at your leisure. There was a yeshiva bocher in the period of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Chia, who was Talmid Chaver of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And he was very careful to wear tzitzit all the time. Apparently not everybody did all the time in those days. So he wears tzitzit all the time. Then the story gets interesting. Apparently, the learning was a bit much for him, and his mind wasn't exactly in his learning. It was elsewhere. It was in sex. And he discovers there's a prostitute who charges 400 gold coins for a visit. Now, 400 is a lot of money. In the Tanakh, in the Talmud, it's always 400 is a large quantity. So we don't know exactly how much. He sends a check or Bitcoin to the prostitute, and he gets an appointment. And when the time comes, he's waiting in the waiting room. And the attendant, the receptionist, ushers him in, and he is allowed to enter the prostitute's room. Now, he sees there 7 beds, 6 of silver, 1 of gold. And between each one, there is a silver ladder, and the top ladder is made of gold. I think the Gemara leaves out what happened as the prostitute rises from the bottom ladder to the top shelf. But anyhow, when she gets to the top, she is completely naked. Now, the yeshiva bocher runs up the ladders in order to get close to her. But as he is stepping onto the top level, his fourth tzitzit smack him in the face, and he falls to the ground. There we are. If you saw the film of Aladdin, the flying carpet, these are the flying tzitzit, and they knocked him to the ground. There we are. What do you know? Now, she also gets down. I mean, this has never happened to her before. And she says, by the Capitol of Rome, I'm not going to let you go until you tell me what was wrong with me. In other words, what was the defect in the goods? Okay, I have a reputation. And he says to her, by the temple service, I've never seen a woman as beautiful as you. But God commanded us to wear tzitzit. And the tzitzit testified to the fact that God will reward those who keep his commandments and punish those who disobey. And it seemed to me that the tzitzit jumped up, reminded me of that, and therefore my passion failed and I fell to the ground. Now, then she continues to question him. I'm on line 1 on page 3. The last 4 words, Amra lo, she says to him, Eini manichacha ad shetomali ma shimcha. I'm not going to leave you until you tell me what your name is, or ma shem ircha, where you live, which city, or ma shem rabach, and who is your teacher of Torah. Or ma shem bet midrashach, shata omed sham Torah, and what's the name of your yeshiva? Tav v'natan biada. He writes the information down for her. And then he goes, Amda v'schilka kol nechaseha. She then closes shop, divides up her property, a third back tax, a third distributes to the poor, and a third she takes with her. She's a smart cookie after all, but she leaves the beds there. Ubat lebet midrasho shel Rabbi Chia. She comes to Rabbi Chia, the Tanna's Bet HaMidrash in Yerushalayim. Amra lo, she says to him, Rebbe, savei alai v'yasuni gioret. I want you to make me into a Jewish woman. Convert me to Judaism. Amar la, so Rabbi Chia says to her, Biti, shema inayich natat ba'achat min ha-talmidim. Why are you converting? Do you want to marry one of these talmidim? She said, yes, took out the piece of paper. This is the guy I want to marry. Amala, now, knowing the Gemara and the Rambam, what should Rabbi Chia have said? No, it's ulterior motive. She wants to marry a Jewish man. We don't convert in the first instance. Amala alechi zechi b'mikcheh. But what does he say? Yes, I'll convert you. The marriage will be a wonderful one, and you have my full blessing. And then the Gemara continues, and so she spread a bed for him. Now, as a married Jewish woman, and that is his reward in this world, and in the world to come, his reward is humongous. So there you are. It's an interesting story. Sometimes learning Gemara can be not boring at all. And there are lessons here. Some of them relate to sex. There is a comment on the part of one of the Mefarshim that the prostitute and the yeshiva bocher never speak until the sexual spell has been broken. Okay? So, he came, he sent, she said, come in. They don't speak. They only start to communicate when they're out of that sexual spell. But the other aspect of this is conversion. How is it possible that both Hillel and Rabbi Chia converted when apparently they shouldn't have converted these candidates at all? They have ulterior motives. So, Jack, we're back to you. Once you've finished your drink, line 7.
I have a little remark.
Okay. Just a second. Jean, what do you have to say?
It's it's not, enfin bon. Amar la lechi zechi b'mikrer, it's verkehrt. Normally the man buys the woman, and here it's presented for the contrary, that she has acquired him.
Now, why do you think that is the case? It says zechi, which is the feminine. You're right. It's usually zecha b'mikrer. Why do you think that Rabbi Chia framed it that way? Zechiya b'mekach is when you have a really good marriage. So what's Rabbi Chia saying here, do you think? What's the underlying idea?
The underlying is that he sees with favor.
He sees it with favor. Why? Because the story is what? Is it one of a non-Jewish woman running after some big, burly, blue-eyed, blonde Jewish guy because he's such a good-looking man? Or what's going on here? Anybody can answer. What is going on here? Why is Rabbi Chia in favor of this marriage? Converting and marrying. Why?
Apparently because he feels that she has really converted in her, she changes her point of view of all of life.
Exactly. Exactement. This is what's happening here. Rabbi Chia is saying the marriage, the guy is only external. What happened here? There was a real spiritual, moral revolution. That's why it's a prostitute. Somebody who is far away from anything Jewish, anything moral, anything ethical, anything spiritual. Her journey is a journey much more dramatic than that of Ruth. It's a journey from one polar opposite to the other, so that the guy, the yeshiva bocher, receives, and the idea of a committed Jewish life comes to the forefront. And in that sense, Jack, can you please give us line 7? In order to reconcile.
In order to reconcile the law with the narratives, the halacha with the Haggadah, the Tosafos suggest that both Hillel and Rabbi Chia were extremely insightful people, and that they understood that the candidate's ulterior motive need not constitute an impediment to them becoming truly God-fearing Jews.
Ahu de Perk Bet de Shabbat, the story of Hillel. Atuach haya Hillel de Sofo lasot Hashem Shamayim. Hillel was certain, he felt, that this particular guy coming in and saying, I want to wear the clothes of a Kohen Gadol, is a cloak for something much deeper, something inside that could turn out to be very good. V'chen ahu datchelet, in Perek Hatchelet in Masechet Malachot, da'atzia lekamei de Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia converted Almanat on condition she'enaseh lo tot talmid, went much further internally than the ulterior motive. So sometimes ulterior motive perhaps is an expression of an inner yearning, and the inner yearning makes the candidate preferential for conversion to Judaism, so that ulterior motivation need not be necessarily fatal. And this idea is deepened by the poskim. Michael, would you please read line 13?
The Tosafot's approach was adopted by the poskim and presented as a general principle of discretion, even in the first instance.
Exactly.
Beit Din always has the right to ignore an ulterior motive if it feels that the candidate will become a God-fearing Jew, notwithstanding.
You can read the line from the Bet Yosef and the Shach.
ומכאן יש ללמוד, ואני?
Yeah.
ומכאן יש ללמוד הכל לפי ראות עיני הבית דין.
Exactly.
Yosef, יורה דעה, blah, 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 etc.
Blah, blah, blah. There are no blah, blah, blahs in the poskim.
Okay.
Yeredea Reish Samechet, Dibur Amatchel Ger Sheba Va'amar, Shach. Yeredea Reish Samechet, Yud Gimel. Okay. So what we have is a very interesting halachic formulation here, where we have discretion on the part of the Bet Din, in a case of ulterior motivation. And we also have two cases which are very dramatic, because in both cases, the Tosafot are convinced that there was something superior about these particular candidates that enabled us to ignore their ulterior motives. But what happens if it's not so, if the cases are not so outstanding? It's not the case of the epiphany of the ex-prostitute, or Hillel's conviction that somehow the request to wear Kohen Gadol's clothes spoke to something deeper. What happens if it's something much more prosaic and much more connected with the survival of the Jewish people or demographic issues? And now we're going to get to read the Rambam's Tshuva. So I will read and translate number 211 in the Blau edition of Rambam's Tuvah.
Ah oui, c'est cette fameuse.
Sheila, question. Ma yomar Adonenu bidvar bachur. What will you, Rambam, say about a single Jewish man, shekana shivcha yefatoa, who bought a beautiful slave girl on the slave market? Now, this is the Muslim world in the 12th century. Muslims bought slaves. They captured them, they sold them on the slave markets, and they had all sorts of forms of marriage under Islamic law. It's not like the unitary marriage in Judaism and Christianity. You can have a wife in every port. There are different levels of marriage. They're easily contracted and easily dissolved. So the idea or the atmosphere was such that if you felt like having some variety in your sex life, you went down to the slave market and bought a beautiful slave girl. Okay, could be European, could be Slavic, could be whatever you wanted. Okay, now this would comport with the mores of Islamic law, but clearly this is not Jewish law. Okay, but there's another complication, as we will see. So our single Jewish young man, okay, a bachur, is keeping this non-Jewish slave girl in the courtyard. Now, it's a big courtyard, and the Jews lived in courtyards, and he lives there with his father's wife, okay, stepmother, and her 3 daughters. So there are people there. He's not alone with her entirely. Naflu dinu dvarim beno ven echav. Now there is a civil dispute going on about money between this young man and his brothers. Tavu ha'ach el hashofet. So the brothers sued the young man in a Muslim court. Achar kach, and when the issue didn't resolve in their favor, they sneakily informed the Muslim judge that the defendant, that's their brother, the single Jewish man, had bought a Christian slave girl and converted her and was living with her. Now, as you know, it's always been an offense for Jews to convert anybody to Judaism on the pain of death. Christians, and certainly under the rules of Omar, you are not allowed to convert Christians, certainly Muslims, to Judaism.
Take it away.
Now,
I'd like to take it away, but I don't want to. I mean, if you know what you're doing, do
do
you know
we
what
have
you're
a bit
doing?
of muting, please? So, Ba Shivcha Lifnei Shofet. So now the Muslim judge calls for the slave girl, the Shala Shofet Mahi, and asks her, what is your religion? Amra Yehudiya Bat Yehudiya Ani. She's been well coached. She says, I'm Jewish. My mother was Jewish. I'm Jewish. Hechzirota lo hashofet. So the shofet gives her back to the young man, ulakacha leveito, and he's now living with her in his home with the stepmother and the 3 girls. The rinana alav ha'ir. Now, the Jewish community is not happy with this, and very sensitive as always to its standard of morals. And so they now want to know what the halakha is. Haim tzrichim bet din lotzia mi beito mishum yichud. You could say that if she's Jewish and she was converted by him, that's a case of yichud. Alpha bishol yitached yima, but it's not really yichud because he's not alone with her. There's a stepmother and the 3 girls. Mishum shene'amar v'yitem nikiyim me'Hashem u'Misrael. But we do have the idea of making the right impression in the eyes of God and in the eyes of human beings. Or nomar mishum she'eshet aviv imo bechatzer einenu chayavim lotzia me etzlo. Or there's no yichud, and clearly there is none. So your reputation is still fine. Or mezeh tam ne'esor yeshivata beveito. The Bet Din and the community want to get rid of this embarrassment. It's a moral stain on the Jewish community. Yoreinu Rabbeinu uscharo kafur min hashamayim. Maimonides, please give us a psak, and your reward will be double from heaven. Hatshuva, what does the Rambam write in reply? Utzrichim bet din achar zot hashmua shelo tova. Clearly, we don't like this sort of thing. We don't want to have this type of stain on our Jewish community because we always have to be squeaky clean in every respect. We either put pressure on him to sell her, he bought her, he can sell her, or yishachrara v'yisa'ena li'isha. Give her a freedom, convert her, and marry her. Now, is that halachically correct? The answer would be absolutely
Very
not.
lenient.
Absolutely not. This is extremely lenient. This is not the case of a woman who's undergone any vast moral or spiritual epiphany. This is not the case of somebody who's heard a pasuk from the Torah and wants to become a Kohen Gadol. This is purely done to save a man from sin and to save the community from a huge embarrassment. Okay? And now the Rambam justifies this and says, but he points out, what does that mean? Even though the Bet Din is committing a type of sin, Rambam knows the law, he codified it. This is clearly, if this woman is going to convert, it's simply to rise from the status of a slave girl to a mistress of the house. Converted, married, respectable, what more could she ask for? But this is purely pragmatic. Where's the spirituality here? Where's the Judaism here? What's going on? Why does the Rambam say the Bet Din should commit ke'en avera, a small type of sin, nachwitadi in Arabic, small type of sin, in order to resolve the situation? לפי שכבר פסקנו פעמים אחדות בכגון אלו המקרים שישחררה וישאנה. Because we've done so in the past, and here we are already getting to the realization that this was not a one-time thing. This tshuva represents a whole background, a social background, the Jewish communities of the time, and the Rambam is dealing with a pan-Jewish world social solution. We have to do this. Why? Now, he says we have to allow people to repent. That's takanat hashavim. We bend the law to allow people to repent. They want to do the right thing. Say they've stolen a wooden beam. In order to repent, they have to give the wooden beam back. If they built the beam into the foundations of their home, then they only have to restore the monetary value of the beam.
Nothing particular.
And we do apply takanat hashavim across the board. We make the path easier for people who've sinned. And then we've said, if you're going to eat treif, better to eat the gravy than the actual bit of pig's fat swimming in the middle of a plate of treif. Okay? So although they're both treif, it's equally treif, somehow we feel instinctively better to convert the non-Jewish girlfriend than to have him live in sin for the rest of his life with a non-Jewish woman. Now, there is a pasuk that says it is time to act for the Lord, break the Torah. Rabbis in two places in the Gemara interpret this a little unusually, and they say, sometimes in order to save the Jewish people from a terrible fate, you have to break a halacha or two. Then we make a time, either you sell her or you convert her and marry her. V'Elohim yitaleh yitaken kilkulenu. And may God help us become better people. Kamo shivtiach va'amar v'asira kol bidilayich. I will remove all of your dross. V'chatav Moshe. So the question is, what was the background to this tshuva? We still have a couple of minutes. Brian, can I ask you to read, please? Unmute. 33.
What was the social background to this responsum? The purchase of a beautiful slave girl for sexual relations was forbidden by the Geonim, Rabbi Natan Gaon, Sha'arei Tzedek 3:6, and continued to be labeled a serious offense by halachic authorities in the succeeding centuries. Rav Yosef Karo considered intercourse with a female slave a grave offense, but in practice he follows Maimonides and rules that violators, who we may imagine were not few, free and convert beautiful women slaves and marry them to limit to one man the effects of this woman's obvious sexual attraction, and thus to ensure that other men did not fall into sin. Very thoughtful.
There we are. We are maintaining the integrity of the Jewish community. That's Kara's approach. But mystics and Kabbalists, this takes us back to the Zohar. Read on.
Mystics and Kabbalists took a much graver view of intercourse with Gentile slave women. In one chapter of his Reshit Chochmah, devoted to special prayers to be said by one who spills semen, Rabbi Elijah Davidus includes in this terrible sin men who lie with non-Jewish female slaves, all of whom he condemns to the severest punishments. All this, of course,
punishments.
The Gemara said, Kanaim Pogimbo.
That is Haboel Aramit.
We are in this. We are here.
In the case,
we have converted her.
But clearly, Kanaim were not very active. So I'm just giving you the general literary background. I think that Kanaim Pogimbo began and ended with Pinchas. Okay? From a historical perspective, I think that that's correct. And the Kanaim were few and far, but the sinners were many. And that's why we have to go to mystical punishments, or we have to be lenient. And the leniency is based upon the Rambam. All of this, Brian, line 7, all of this, of course.
All this, of course, points to the fact that the offense itself was a common one. And this accounts for the fact that, by and large, halachic authorities seem to have resigned themselves to reality and limited themselves to condemnations, prescribing mild punishments, if at all. No doubt they understood that to decree harsh punishments would be to issue rulings with which the public could not, nor would not, abide.
En gozrin al hatzibur gzera she'en hatzibur yachol la'amod ba. It would have been
exceedingly difficult to prevent Jews from doing what was so widely accepted by Islamic urban culture as socially legitimate. Under the influence of Islam, cohabitation with slaves was considered by the general population.
Legitimate by the general Jewish population. So Rambam is responding to what's going on in his time. That's how I read this unusual responsum of the Rambam. This is the social background. Jeff Fisher, line 15.
This is the social background to the ruling issued by Maimonides that notwithstanding the minor sin involved in converting the slave girl, the Bet Din should go ahead with the conversion.
And read 19, please, clauses.
Clauses in Ketubot discovered in the Cairo Geniza forbidding the groom to purchase a slave girl, convert her, and have her as another wife.
That means it happened. So I'm going to close the share. Okay? So what we've begun is an adventure. We're going to use Rambam's Teshuvah and have a look at how halakha in relation to ulterior motive was shaped through the ages. But I'm going to say a bit more about Rambam's Teshuvah And here the Rambam is clearly concerned with Jewish society as a whole. He's aware of what is going on. He's aware of what needs to be done in order to ensure that we do not have a serious problem here. Because if we do not convert and we do not marry halachically, we're going to have many non-Jewish children. And this could amount to an almost serious demographic threat in the East, in the world of Islam. So the way to get around it is to be flexible and to use halachic arguments such as takanat hashavim. We're going to help the guy repent. We are going to go for the lesser of the two evils. Better to eat the forbidden gravy than the forbidden fat. We're also going to say, Et lasot Hashem heferu toratecha. Rashi did something similar. When Rashi says, there's no way you lose your Jewish identity, his support is very thin. It's an agadah. It's a pasuk in Yeshayahu, or rather in Yoshua, Chatu Yisrael, Afal pi shechatu Yisrael, because he has to respond to what's happening in the Jewish community of his time. This is the role of the Meshiv, the responder, to take the law and to apply it to the here and now, not to sit in the ivory castle and build a nice intellectual edifice, but he's got a real problem to solve. And that real problem requires flexibility. How this flexibility works with an understandable desire not to make Judaism so dilute that anybody can convert and say they are Jewish even though they have no intention of keeping anything of religion at all, is an issue which we will confront next week and possibly the week after. But we're going to have an interesting foray next week into the Cairo Geniza. We're going to meet Rabbi Raphael Ibn Shimon. We're going to meet Solomon Schechter, the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of that awaits, same time, same place, a week from today. Have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions and comments, of course, are always welcome. But otherwise, I'll say Shtika Kohoda Adami and Brian. Just bye-bye.
I need to say Shikoyach.
Bruchim tiyu. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See ya. All the best.
All right.
Erev Tov and Besorot Tovot. Bye.